Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wondered if those little blips of strange thoughts some people have are a big deal, especially for teenagers? Today we're diving deep into psychotic experiences and how we can find them early. So imagine these researchers want to know if a special questionnaire called the Adolescent Psychotic-like Symptom Screener, or APSS, is actually good at spotting teenagers who might be experiencing what we call psychotic experiences. These aren't full-blown psychosis, but things like hearing voices or feeling someone is spying on you. They happen more often than you might think, and knowing about them early could be super important for getting kids the help they need. This study wanted to really put the APSS to the test using a big group of students. What they did was gather information from over 17,000 middle and high school students. Think of that, a massive group. They used a special way to analyze the survey results called Item Response Theory, or ERT. It is a fancy way of looking at how each question on a test or survey works and how it relates to the overall score. It's like being a detective for each individual question to see how well it's doing its job. The first big finding was that the APSS seems to measure one main thing, which is these psychotic experiences. It is not all over the place, but focuses on that one core idea. They found that a model called the graded response model fit the data really nicely, meaning the questions and how people answer them make sense under this theory. Now, let's talk about what the actual questions are like. The study found that every single question on the APSS was really good at its job. They called this high discrimination. This means each question does a good job of telling apart people who have more of these experiences from people who have less. However, here is a crucial part. The thresholds for most questions were quite high. A threshold is basically the point on the scale where someone is likely to say they've experienced something. So, for most questions, you had to be pretty far along the psychotic experience scale to even say maybe or yes. What does this mean practically? It means the APSS is really good at telling you who has a lot of these experiences. It is most precise or reliable when you are an adolescent experiencing things quite noticeably, about 1.5 standard deviations above the average. But it is not so great at telling you who has very few or no experiences. If you're at the low end of the scale, the APSS doesn't give you a very clear picture. It's like a thermometer that's great at measuring high temperatures, but not so accurate when it's chilly. They also checked if the survey questions work the same way for different groups of kids, like boys and girls, or younger versus older teens. This is called checking for differential item functioning, or DIF. They found a few instances where questions might have worked slightly differently for different groups, but most of these effects were tiny. Interestingly, when they looked at who was reporting these experiences, they found that older students and male students tended to report fewer psychotic experiences. There was also a small interaction, meaning the way age-affected reports was a little different for boys and girls. But overall, younger girls seemed to report higher levels of these experiences in this study. So, what is the big takeaway? The APSS is a great tool if your goal is to find teenagers who are experiencing a significant number of psychotic-like symptoms and might need extra help. It is efficient because it's short. However, if you are trying to sort out who has absolutely no experiences from who has just a tiny little bit, this screener isn't your best bet. It is a fine tooth comb for the upper end of the symptom range, not for the lower end. Looking at the raw numbers, you can see that most students reported very few symptoms. The means for each item are pretty low, and the scores are skewed, meaning most people are clustered at the no or maybe end. But when you look at how questions relate to each other, they tend to be pretty highly correlated, which again supports that idea of measuring one main thing. When the researchers compared different ways to model the data, the graded response model, or GRM, stood out as the best fit. This model is really good at handling questions that have more than two answer choices, like the no, maybe yes. On the APSS, the fit statistics for this model were excellent, meaning the data really lined up with what this model predicted. Here are the details about how each question performs. The discrimination parameters, which show how well each question distinguishes between those with higher and lower experiences, were really high across the board. The threshold parameters are those points we talked about, and as noted, they're mostly on the higher side. For example, the item about hearing voices had one of the lower thresholds, but it was still high, suggesting you need to have experienced it quite a bit to tick yes. This figure really paints a picture of the APSS's strengths and weaknesses. Panel B shows the test information function, which is basically how much reliable information the whole test gives you at different levels of psychotic experiences. You can clearly see a big hump peaking around 1.5 standard deviations above the average, and then it drops off steeply at lower levels. Panel C shows reliability. And it is high where the information is high but very low at the lower end. This plot is fascinating because it compares the traditional sum score you might get by just adding up the item scores versus the ERT-based scores. While they are highly related, the ERT scores are more nuanced. They take into account how well each item works, meaning different combinations of answers that add up to the same sum score can actually result in different IRT scores. This suggests IRT scores can be more precise. This table sums up the differential item functioning. Remember those small effects. The biggest ones were for the grandiosity and spying items. For grandiosity, male students were a bit more likely to say yes, and for spying, they were a bit less likely. These effects are small, and importantly, they push in opposite directions, meaning they probably don't cause a big overall bias in the total score. Here is where we see the impact of sex and age on the overall level of psychotic experiences. As we mentioned, the analysis shows that being male and being older are linked to lower reported experiences. Model 4, which includes the interaction, shows that the age effect is a bit stronger for girls than for boys, meaning younger girls in this sample reported the most experiences. This is a really important demographic finding. So let's circle back to the big picture. This study is great because it gives us a really solid understanding of the APSS using advanced statistical methods on a huge group of teenagers. We now know it is a strong tool for finding kids who are struggling with more significant psychotic experiences. It does its job well in the high-risk zone. This is super important because early identification can lead to early intervention, which can make a huge difference in a young person's life. However, and this is a critical however for researchers, if you are studying general population trends or looking for subtle variations in very low levels of symptoms, the APSS might not be precise enough. It is like trying to measure the exact temperature of a room that's already pretty cool. The thermometer just isn't designed for that level of detail at the low end. To double-check their findings, they looked at the data from another angle using factor analysis, which is another way to study how questions relate to each other. This analysis also strongly supported the idea that the APSS measures one primary thing, reinforcing the IRT findings. They also explored a slightly different statistical model called the unipolar log logistic model. Think of it as a way to specifically model the absence of experiences as a meaningful point. The results from this model were very similar to the main analysis, so it didn't change their overall conclusions. This just shows how robust their findings are. Here is a really interesting part. They looked at the data through the lens of network psychometrics. Instead of assuming one underlying factor drives all the answers, this approach looks at how symptoms might directly influence each other. For example, could hearing voices make someone more likely to feel spied on? The network analysis showed that while there are some connections between symptoms, the idea of one main underlying factor, like the APSS measuring a general level of psychotic experiences, still holds up really well. Since the data came from schools, they checked if scores varied much between different schools. They found that the vast majority of the differences in APSS scores were between individual students, not between schools themselves. This means that the experiences students are having are more about individual differences than school-level factors. This section really hammers home the benefit of using ERT scoring. They compared how well ERT-based scores, called EEP scores, correlated with other measures of mental health compared to the simple sum scores. The EP scores showed slightly stronger correlations, suggesting they are indeed a more reliable measure of the underlying trait. They even estimated that using EAP scores could be as good as increasing your sample size by about 11%, which is pretty significant. And for all you data nerds out there, the researchers have even provided the actual R code they used to calculate these ERT-based scores. This means other researchers can use their carefully calibrated parameters to score their own APSS data, leading to more consistent and accurate results across studies. Now, my take on this research. It's a really solid study because they use a huge sample size and a sophisticated statistical approach like IRT that gives us a lot of confidence in their findings about the APSS. The biggest strength is how thoroughly they've characterized the instrument's performance. They've clearly shown it is great for finding kids at higher risk, but less so for the very low end, for weaknesses. As the authors themselves point out, this is a self-report measure. Some responses might be due to misunderstandings or cultural differences, not necessarily clinical symptoms. Also, while they looked at age and sex, they didn't explore differences across racial or socioeconomic groups, which could be an important next step. The real world implications are huge. This study confirms that the APSS is a valuable tool for schools and clinicians. It is a quick way to flag adolescents who might be on a difficult path, allowing for earlier support and intervention. It also gives us more confidence in interpreting scores. especially knowing that higher scores are more precisely measured. Future research could definitely build on this. They could explore adding more nuanced response options or items that are easier to endorse to get a better read on lower symptom levels. And of course, more diff analyses across different demographics would be beneficial. Overall, this research is a great example of how we can use powerful statistical tools to really understand the instruments we use to measure important psychological constructs. It provides a clearer picture of how the APSS works, making it an even more useful tool for supporting adolescent mental health. What are your thoughts on screening for these experiences? Does it feel helpful or intrusive? Let me know in the comments below. And if you found this breakdown helpful, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe to Rubin's Mind Lab for more science explained simply, and hit that notification bell so you don't miss our next dive into the fascinating world of psychology. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.